The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I have a truly extraordinary turn of events to tell you about today. The plans, which according to our president and to his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and many other people, simply didn't exist for Trump Tower Moscow, have been found. And not only do plans exist, they even include the idea of bribing Russian President Vladimir Putin with a penthouse apartment worth $50 million in implicitly exchange for allowing the project to go forward as planned. And this is such an incredible situation and such a turn of events that it's almost cartoonish in a sense. I mean, the degree to which the reality differs from the story that we have gotten from the president and the people surrounding him could not be more different. For months or even longer at this point, probably a year or more since the Trump Tower Moscow issue has been sort of floating around, we've been told that Trump Tower Moscow was basically nothing, right? It was mentioned, okay, but Trump himself wasn't thinking about it. He wasn't working on it. He certainly wasn't directing anyone, including his lawyer, Michael Cohen, to do much to push forward the project of Trump Tower Moscow. It was more or less a silly pipe dream. Would have been nice to do if it worked out, but essentially no Trump organization energy beyond a couple phone calls maybe or an email here and there were put together and were actions that were taken. We were led to believe that it was more of a, we'll look into it, but nothing actually happened at all ever. And as we heard many times, there were certainly no physical plans for the building at all, nothing specific. This project was effectively a notion buried deep in the mind of some small number of people in Donald Trump's organization, period. One of the people fomenting that narrative is Donald Trump's television attorney, Rudy Giuliani, who said to the New Yorker just about 48 hours ago that, quote, no plans were ever made. There were no drafts, nothing in the file. That's a direct quote from Rudy Giuliani. And as I mentioned yesterday, Rudy Giuliani is a lawyer, but he is really serving as Trump's public propagandist lawyer. He's not making legal statements, but we'll still evaluate that statement on its merits. No plans were ever made. There were no drafts, nothing in the file. Except that in their second blockbuster this week, Buzzfeed News, it's not BuzzFeed, it's Buzzfeed News, has obtained the plans for Trump Tower Moscow. They exist. They existed. They were created. And those plans and text messages and emails even outline how Vladimir Putin would be effectively bribed into going along with the project with a penthouse worth an estimated $50 million. BuzzFeed News has obtained hundreds of pages of documents and emails and text messages and even architectural plans and a whole bunch of other stuff. We have a rendering of what Trump Tower Moscow was set to look like. We had also the indication that it would be 1,500 and, it would be taller than 1,516 feet tall, which was the height of the Lakta Center in St. Petersburg. Comparing it to other notable world buildings, including the Commerzbank Tower in Frankfurt and the Eiffel Tower and the Shard in London. Here's a rendering of what this particular building would have looked like in Moscow. You can see it in the context of the Moscow skyline with the Moscow River in the background. Here's a rendering of the atrium inside Trump Tower Moscow, complete with a view, again, of the Moscow River out the windows of the building. And you might be saying, well, if they knew that you could see the Moscow River out the windows, did they know where the building would go? Yes, they did. We have a map that is part of these documents, which includes the proposed development site for the building, again, right on the Moscow River, with an amazing, beautiful view of Presnensky District. And it turns out that it's not just a couple of renderings. There were already architectural plans by September of 2015. The plans laid out how Trump Tower Moscow would be a glass obelisk. It would be 100 stories tall with this sort of diamond-like shape at the top that, if you've been watching with us, you saw in the images we showed you already. Not only were there plans, the plans had also been sent to the Russian developer that was engaged to actually do the construction. That's Andrew Rozov. He indicated he was ready to get started on this project. And there is also, as Rudy Giuliani did admit, there is this finalized letter of intent signed by Donald Trump from about a month after the architectural plans had been filed. And that includes that this building would contain 250 luxury condos in the tower, 15 floors of hotel with 150 hotel rooms. There would be a spa, there would be a fitness center, there would be a commercial space, as well as what is called Class A office space in the United States, or more upscale luxury type office space. The letter of intent even specifies that Donald Trump would be paid $4 million up front. He would then get 25% when the licensing agreement is executed, 25% when the location is finalized, and the other half of that $4 million based on some other milestones. Trump would get a cut of condo sales. He would get a management fee for 25 years. He would get profit sharing from the hotel. And then after all of that, which already tells us it wasn't just a nothing notion that Trump wasn't at all involved in and that nobody was taking seriously. There were architectural plans. There were licensing fees and future profit streams all laid out there. Then we get to the gift to Putin for going along with all of this. The top of the building was slated to have a penthouse apartment. The market value would be roughly $50 million. And as previously reported by Buzzfeed News, the plan was to give that away for free to Vladimir Putin just to have himself. This was not just an idea in a Trump staffer's mind, because two law enforcement officials have confirmed that Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, personally discussed gifting the penthouse to Vladimir Putin with an aide to Putin's press secretary, and it could have even gone further than that. We just aren't sure yet. This is what we call a bribe, okay? Russian oligarch Felix Sater, who is working with Trump on this and was a key player in the Trump-Russia probe, is on record saying, quote, "My idea was to give a $50 million penthouse to Putin and to charge $250 million more for the rest of the units. All the oligarchs would line up to live in the same building as Putin." Sater was involved in gifting the penthouse to Putin. Michael Cohen was involved in discussions about that. An aide to Putin's press secretary was involved in that discussion. And then we get to the degree of involvement that Donald Trump may or may not have had. Donald Trump has denied having any interests in Russia. He's denied being in regular contact with anybody about this project. But Buzzfeed, who did their homework on this, can now report that Donald Trump received at least 10 updates about the project that they know of specifically. And of course, in all of this is the allegation that Trump directed Michael Cohen to lie to Congress about it on the basis of that Buzzfeed News report from a few days ago. The cherry on top, this tweet from Trump in 2013, directed at Aras Agalarov. "I had a great weekend with you and your family. You have done a fantastic job. Trump Tower Moscow is next. Amin was wow." Amin is, I believe, Aras's son and was involved in that Trump Tower meeting that took place in 2016. So what's next? It's going to be what? Rudy Giuliani saying, "Of course we had plans. It's a real estate deal. You need plans. But so what? Making plans isn't a crime. Licensing agreements aren't crimes. Gifting penthouses to presidents of foreign countries to get deals approved, that's not a crime. This is just business." And then the next day, Rudy will tell us, "That was a hypothetical statement that I made. That wasn't a legal statement. I was hypothetically quoting myself as Trump's attorney, but it was just hypothetical. It wasn't real." And of course, it would also be wrong, because there is this thing called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977. It's also called FCPA. And it very specifically has anti-bribe provisions regarding using money or things of value to influence or obtain authorization for or promises from foreign officials in their official capacity. So for everybody saying There's nothing here. This is merely a businessman, Trump, trying to build a tower. That's not true. There are a lot of issues here. It might violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It would be indicative of the fact that Donald Trump was not telling the truth about his involvement here all along. There are all sorts of different crimes potentially tied up in this. The penthouse was a thing of value. Offering it to Putin to get an advantage in terms of permitting and going forward with the project could indeed be criminal. And then lastly, the other potentially criminal element here, this project was set to receive funding from the VTB Bank in Russia. VTB Bank, at the time that these discussions were going on, was under sanctions by the United States of America, which makes the financing of Trump Tower Moscow, which we now know did have architectural plans, it makes the financing potentially illegal as well. So what will they say? Will they say the Buzzfeed report is simply wrong? Because every time they do that, Buzzfeed comes out with more documentary evidence about this. Will they say, well, Cohen acted alone. He's a liar and a convicted felon. Does anybody believe for a moment that Donald Trump would be not involved in the plans to build the biggest building in Europe, including the gift of a $50 million penthouse to Vladimir Putin? When 9/11 happened, Trump went on TV and bragged as a result of 9/11 and the Twin Towers being knocked down, his building is now the tallest in Lower Manhattan. Does anybody believe that a guy who does that that's what he thinks of when the Twin Towers are knocked down by foreign terrorists? Does anyone believe he wouldn't be involved in the building of the tallest building in Europe, which was set to have his name on it? Every single lie here is falling apart. Let me know your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at dpacman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Dr. Marlene Solgruber. Dr. Marlene Solgruber, thank you for being a supporter of the show. Also want to thank Michael O'Brien, who is today's longtime sustaining member of the day with us almost 5 years. Dr. Marlene and Michael, thanks to both of you. We are going to be sending out just a blockbuster, massive, this is going to get Trump tweeting fake news, it's so crazy, membership special on my birthday on February 2nd. If you want to be notified about that membership discount, get on our mailing list at davidpakman.com. And on February 2nd, you will be notified. Here's how to take advantage of this offer that is so good, you might think it's fake news. And no gifts, please. Just sign up for membership. That's all I'm asking for my birthday this year. Okay, it's time for Hatriot Mail. Quick reminder about what Hatriot Mail is, and then I've got a special Hatriot Mail announcement for you momentarily here.
We're so alt-right, it's wrong. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
So we've made an investment in Hatriot Mail. For years now, Hatriot Mail has had the same backing track for the Hatriot messages. Along with Hatriot Mail Guy, we procured licenses for some additional backing tracks, and I think that they kind of add an entire new layer of nuttiness and wackiness to Hatriot Mail. So today, with today's episode of Hatriot Mail, we're debuting one of the new backing tracks. Let's take a listen to it.
Oh, wah! A Jew denying the idea of deep state? What a coincidence! Lol. The deep state runs Washington. Mossad's not a secret, Parkman. It's not even news. Oh, David, you're so clever in trying to cover your tracks, but we all know.
Yeah, so the typical anti-Semitism of Hatriot Mail, of course, Jews like me would deny the existence of the deep state, because Jews are a big part of the deep state. Not a surprise. But that music, Pat, that really is a whole new element to Hatriot Mail, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an exciting time to be alive. And of course, the Hatriot here struggled to spell the word your. There are different spellings and uses of the word your, so I can see how that can happen. So he just abbreviated YR. That works for me.
Yeah, a common error in Hatriot Mail is YOUR instead of YOU''RE. This Hatriot completely circumvented it by just replacing it with the word YR. And that is it's certainly a way to avoid the you are confusion for sure. We have a coupon code Hatriot40. If you use that code when you get a membership on our website, you will save 40%. And many, many Hatriots cry every time that coupon code is used because it just shows the backfire of their angry ranting. So use that coupon code HATRIOT40 to discount the membership of your choice at www.joinpacman.com. Let's talk about Syria. When Donald Trump announced that the United States military would be leaving Syria, a lot of different questions came up. We were wondering, well, why right now? Why now as opposed to at any other time? What happens to the Kurds? Because if the U.S. Military bails on Syria, even if we want them out, that is going to open up the Kurds to significant abuse from Turkey. What will Turkey do geopolitically as a result of this? How does Saudi Arabia play into this entire story? And how does the Jamal Khashoggi killing potentially relate to this? Are we even really leaving? Because you'll remember after Donald Trump said that American troops are leaving Syria, we heard from National Security Advisor John Bolton, oh, yeah, no, I mean, yes, we might leave at some point, but only when this whole list of things happens, including the defeat of ISIS, which Trump said did happen and Mike Pence said did happen, but John Bolton said did not quite yet happen. So all of these scenarios combined with the sort of haphazard nature of Donald Trump saying we were leaving, the resignation of Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, it all was a cluster F. I think you all know what I'm talking about. At the same time, I've been seeing on cable news Erik Prince appear and make the case that U.S. military should be replaced with mercenaries in Syria. Now, why is this relevant? Well, for a few reasons. Erik Prince, if you don't know who he is number one, the founder of that paramilitary mercenary firm that used to be known as Blackwater. He also happens to be the brother of Donald Trump's Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. And he is also an increasingly notable talking head on cable news talking about Syria. And it just so happens that Erik Prince, who reportedly has a net worth of more than $2 billion by selling private war around the world, it just so happens he has a solution to both get American soldiers out of Syria, which he thinks is a good idea, and to keep the Kurds safe, and to keep fighting ISIS, which is that his mercenaries can go in. It's the perfect plan, right? He has been more and more of a presence on television. I saw him on CNN about a week ago with Aaron Burnett. He appeared on Fox Business where he straight up said, "Send in Academy with an I." That is the renamed former Blackwater, which I think had an intermediate renaming as well, something with an X, like
Z Services.
There was it went from G Service, yeah, XE. That's exactly it. He said, if there is not some kind of robust capability to defend from a ground invasion from the very conventional power that the Iranians and the Syrians have, our allies there will be smashed. And his solution is privatize the war, send in the paramilitary mercenary types. And this has been his solution for how many decades at this point, Pat? So this is sketchy not only because he's Betsy DeVos's brother, it's sketchy because he's been wrapped up in attempts to create that back channel between Kushner and the Russians via a meeting in the Seychelles. You might remember Erik Prince's name coming up there. And all of a sudden now, Erik Prince reappears saying, I've got a perfect solution to get us out of Syria.
Well, he has all the right ins, being Betsy DeVos's brother, and he's making the rounds on cable news. So that's some great auditioning there. The problem with this, of course, is that there's very little oversight. I mean, Blackwater can get away with things that maybe the military can't get away with. And this is probably going to be the new paradigm. If we pull out our troops from Syria, someone else is going to take their place, unfortunately, and that's what he's pushing for.
So, yeah, there are two stories here, as Pat is pointing out. One is this guy in particular has been horrible for a very long time, and now we can sort of explain Donald Trump's haphazard Syria decision, potentially, right? This is all hypothetical, to quote Rudy Giuliani. We could hypothetically explain it by saying, well, part of Trump specifically choosing now as the time to do this is that it is a coordinated way to hand cash over to his education secretary's brother, Betsy DeVos's brother, Erik Prince. That's one story. But this isn't just Trump. I mean, Trump might be particularly corrupt and cronyistic in this particular example, but this is the military-industrial complex, right? Decade after decade, these organizations, Blackwater, XE, and now Academy, the same organization. This is why many around the world consider us to be the bad guys, to use a really unsophisticated term. And Erik Prince is one of the head guys that makes the world see us that way. And again, $2 billion selling private warfare around the world. And this is actually a recipe for never leaving Syria. Okay, that's the most important thing to understand. Trump claims the priority is we're getting out of Syria, period. Doesn't matter what happens, and we can debate whether that makes sense. Getting out in order to send in Academy and start paying the mercenaries to be there, that is a recipe for them being there for 15 or 20 years in some capacity, continuing to make Erik Prince an even bigger billionaire than he already is. How relevant do you think Erik Prince and his presence advocating for this and his connection to Trump's cabinet is to Donald Trump's haphazard decision to get out of Syria? Let me know. Make sure you're following me on Instagram at david.pacman. And while you're there, if you have an Instagram account, follow The David Pakman Show as well, at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Andrew Bustamante, who is a former covert CIA officer and also founder of the Everyday Espionage training platform. Andrew, so great to talk to you. I appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you for having me, David.
So how did you get into this type of work? I guess initially, how did you get into the CIA? And then once in, what sort of path? How is the particular path that one takes determined?
Wow, it's everybody has their own journey in. So for me, my specific journey was actually not towards CIA at all. I was trying to live out my lifelong dream of becoming a hippie. I was on my way in the middle of an application process to the Peace Corps when I got one of those notifications that the skill sets that I brought to the table might have utility in another part of the government. When I got that notification, it asked if I would be willing to consider alternate options. And of course, like any 27-year-old at the time, I said, yeah, there's other options. Let's do it. And that's how I ended up getting a phone call from an unknown number that asked me if I would be interested in coming up to Langley, Virginia, to talk about how I might be of service to the CIA. I was coming out of the Air Force, so I had a clearance that was pretty unique. I had background in nuclear missiles. I had in a strategic language. So it made sense to me when I was asked, but it wasn't a direction I think that I intentionally went and sought out myself.
And what was the strategic language?
I spoke Chinese.
Okay.
Yeah, my Chinese is very old now, and anybody who speaks a foreign language knows that they age over time. You lose your fluency. The wiring is always up there to rebuild it, but it does stale. So I ended up replacing Chinese with multiple languages during my time at the agency. And my last language with the agency was actually Thai, which is also now aged and a little bit stale, but don't tell my tutor.
Can you talk a little bit about, I think that we've interviewed former FBI agents, including folks like Mark Ruskin, who has done a lot of undercover work. And one of the most common answers I get when I say, what are the misconceptions that the public has about the work that you do? The most common one, generally speaking, is a sort of very cartoonish view of what it is. High stakes raids constantly. Everything involves weapons and much more resembling a movie than a sort of a day-to-day law enforcement work. So can you talk a little bit about what the majority of your day-to-day was?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the biggest misconception about intelligence work is that it's done at the last minute or it's done off the cuff. Really, most of our time is actually spent planning and assessing risk and mitigating risk, finding alternate ways to get the information that we're trying to achieve. So for any given operation, let's say it's a one-day operation, there's going to be months worth of planning beforehand. And that planning isn't all that different from the kind of project planning that you see in a commercial enterprise. People get together and they talk about where they're going to get the right loan or who they can trust to be the best salesperson for something, or how to assess advertising versus marketing costs. It's very similar to that. Months worth of planning in your day-to-day life before you actually ever get on a plane to go execute.
On a day-to-day basis, how political are the operations that you were involved in? And I'll add some context. So as you're probably aware, right now, the entire intelligence community has sort of become the center of very, very political debates related to investigations of the president, former investigations into Hillary Clinton, day-to-day decisions, text messages of Peter Strzok from the FBI, and how where there is a line between one's personal politics and their work within the agency. So can you talk a little bit about how much are politics present when someone is working in the types of operations you worked on?
That question is a good question. There's actually, I want to paint two different pictures at the same time.
Yeah.
You've got the people who are actually executing the operation, and then you have the leadership that's in charge of prioritizing, funding, and directing the operation. Obviously, at the funding level, at the level of leadership, it's not super political, but it is political, because the executive is the one who dictates intelligence policy. The policymakers, your senators, your congresspeople, et cetera, are the ones that dictate the collection priorities underneath that executive agenda. So in order to be able to justify an operation, you have to be in tune with what the executive and the policyholders are willing to fund. Otherwise, you're going to propose an operation and they're going to say there's no interest in that operation, so no, you can't execute it. That's the more political arm of how intelligence works. The actual boots on the ground, the folks who are really doing the work, the folks who are putting their life on the line to collect intelligence, there's no politics in what they're doing. What they're doing is what they were told to do, because the intelligence infrastructure is still a hierarchical government organization. They're doing what they committed to do to keep America safe, to meet the requirements of the policymakers above them. So one of the difficult things is when you look at these conspiracy theories about how there's all these loose cannons at the agency, it's actually quite the opposite. We are doing exactly what we're told, but maybe what we're being told by the policymakers to do isn't representative of the constituencies that they claim to represent.
And what are some of those types of things that you were told to do? In other words, when we say you worked covertly in the CIA, what might be some examples of the types of operations that you were involved in?
I have to be really general here to maintain my lifetime non-disclosure agreement. But
sure.
So to give some examples, trade priorities, right? What is it that America is willing to debate or negotiate on in terms of a large-scale trade priority in a foreign nation? There might be something that we are willing to negotiate about because it's of interest to policymakers, whatever the trade might be, whatever the trade item might be. But when we get to the table, we might choose to take a different route because the policymaker is the one making the decision about what the negotiation is or isn't. So you'll have an intelligence officer out there collecting the ground source truth about whatever that trade commodity might be, or whatever process goes into making the commodity. If you're talking about child labor, if you're talking about some kind of abuse of position or unfair trade practices, when the information is shared with the policymaker still gets to make the decision whether or not they leverage the information they were given, or if they just choose to go out on their own with maybe a source of information from a different intelligence service like DIA or NSA.
So is that sort of like collecting a blackmail file of sorts, to apply a negative term to it? But in other words, you're collecting information that, if the circumstances warrant it, could be used to gain leverage over a negotiating partner.
No, I wouldn't compare it to blackmail because of one very important reason. Blackmail is meant to intentionally force someone's hand through some negative incentive, right? What we are absolutely doing is collecting information that can be used for leverage, but that leverage doesn't have to be negative, right? In most cases, using some sort of conspiratorial or some sort of negative lever is actually a way to destroy negotiations, which is kind of what we've seen happen with our government shutdown. Yeah. We don't want to destroy negotiations. We want to add positive leverage to give us an advantage in negotiations.
What are the skills that go into the type of work that you did? And this will sort of start to get us a little bit into the Everyday Espionage training platform that you've developed. What are the sort of primary skills, and then how do some of those translate into sort of utility for the everyday person in their day-to-day life?
Yeah, there's a number of different skills that agency officers use in the field and also in the workforce, and as they deal with other agency officers who are, doing the same kind of work, and we have competing priorities. The reason that I feel like there's value in these skills in the real world is because much of what an intelligence officer does in their day-to-day life is just a different derivative of what everyday people do. But we don't know that because that's not the picture that Hollywood paints. So as an example, we have a concept that we have a proprietary term, but it's a concept that I tend to reference and I call direct dialogue. It's when you shape a dialogue between two people, because a dialogue has to have inputs from two people. But you shape the content of that dialogue with a very specific, direct intention at the end. It's not that different from, say, a negotiation, except that people go into a negotiation knowing that there's something they want at the other side. The vast majority of conversation, the majority of dialogue between any two people is actually, it's got no direction. It has no express purpose except to just be dialogue. When you learn how the mind works, when you go through farm training or when you go through some of the advanced training at CIA, you start to realize that there is actually a purpose behind every dialogue. We just don't define it before we start talking. Direct helps people to understand you have a purpose. There's something that you want. Maybe it's not going to happen in one conversation. Maybe it takes 12 conversations. But how do you start strategically laying the foundation so that you are in control of the dialogue from beginning to end? That has huge utility if you're talking about a career choice, a promotion, or some sort of big project that you want to take on. It has everything to do with a relationship, building a relationship, whether it's a marriage or a business partnership, or even a relationship with your kids, to have control over the dialogue itself so that you can build a very specific outcome that you're pushing for.
So I think that one is an easy one for most people to understand. It relates to sort of conversational dynamics and social psychology. What about some that might be less obvious skills that would translate from clandestine and covert work to day-to-day life?
So there's a second example that I don't know if it qualifies as less obvious, but I have certainly seen it run into significant roadblocks. And that skill is situational awareness. Most people are aware of the term situational awareness, but I find that there is a lack of conviction in understanding how to use and apply situational awareness. So just as a quick example, Everyday Espionage, I build curriculum. I provide spy training courses to people to teach them these skills in the context of the real world, using the confines and the definitions that we use in espionage. When I introduce this idea of situational awareness to specific leaders, in my example, Florida state schools, county public schools for students, I explained that situational awareness could reduce the incident, the risk of an attack from any kind of mass shooter, any kind of violent act, a kidnapping, drug dealers, whatever might be happening on a school ground, simple situational awareness would help resolve that. Situational awareness among your teachers, among your staff, among your students. When I laid out this very simple concept and I explained how field officers are taught situational awareness because they are independently responsible for their own safety. And because of that, they need to be more aware of their environment than anybody else. When I explained that to the school board, I had overwhelming support from police and fire department representatives and EMTs and anybody who is familiar with first responder duties, but it landed on absolute deaf ears with the school board itself. Even before we started talking about how much it would cost to teach people situational awareness, which cost very low, once we started even entertaining the idea that people had to take independent responsibility for their safety, the whole conversation broke down. And that same breakdown has happened on multiple fronts as I've tried to engage nonprofits, as I've tried to engage for-profits. There's this cultural tendency in America that we are supposed to outsource our security. It's somebody else's problem. It's the police department's responsibility. It's the security department, some security forces' responsibility. It's our parents' responsibility. It's our employer's responsibility to keep us safe, when in fact, that's not the case.
Well, I think that you're right that for some people, there's a very specific explanation that is aligned with their maybe values or worldview, or they would say it's simply, I believe the responsibility falls on someone else. But to take a step back from that element of it, there's also something maybe a little bit unnatural about sort of like a persistent situational awareness. I mean, most people, I think, if they're in a movie theater, for example, and they just get immersed in the movie that they're watching, as an example, or you're on a plane and at a certain point, you're not necessarily in that state because you're just reading a book or looking out the window or whatever. There is something a little bit unnatural that requires training about maintaining that kind of awareness, is there not?
No, you're absolutely correct. That's why I think it is a valid training opportunity. But along with the training of how to maintain situational awareness, there's also the training that goes into how best to utilize it. You can't be in what we call a yellow state all the time, constantly scanning for risks. But what you can do is know when you need to be in a yellow state and when it's safe to be in a green state or a white state, a state of safety. It's just like driving a car. You're supposed to be in a yellow status when you drive. Looking at windows, being constantly aware. But we all know that more and more people are driving in a green state or a white state where they're looking at a phone or they're playing with a radio when they should be paying attention to the threats around them.
Before we sort of start winding down, I wanted to get your thoughts on if you think forward looking in the next few years, what would you assess as the biggest national security risk to the United States? And so all answers are valid, whether it's something along the lines of cyber attacks, climate change, anything. I mean, really just based on the work that you do, what are you looking at right now?
I'm always watching technology. Specifically, I'm watching how people replace daily or individual actions with technology. Social media, I think, was a fantastic example back in the early 2000s. It started to replace actual physical social interaction. And you start to see how people replace being in a actual work environment with working remotely. So the phone and email and IMs and text messages replace what was otherwise actual human collaboration. So I'm always looking towards how technology is going to impact us. And the reason I find it to be so interesting is because technology takes gigantic innovative steps forward. And then we as humans are left trying to catch up, trying to find a use for them. So I've actually commented on anything from social media to blockchain technology to future innovations when it comes to how Wi-Fi or how information will be communicated in the future. Technology is, for me, both the greatest opportunity and in many ways the greatest threat that faces us.
Yeah, and that could go in a lot of different directions, but it sounds like as a possibility under that umbrella, cyber warfare is definitely a possible component, at least.
I don't know if I would call it cyber warfare, and I understand what you're trying to say. You're trying to get me to a specific threat, right?
Yes.
But I want to avoid specific threats because especially in this area, cyber warfare, as an example, there's not many people out there who can engage in it. So what level of threat is it really if there aren't many players that can really leverage that threat. If someone chose to make a cyber attack, it would be terrifying, right? It would be devastating. If somebody chose to, say, attack infrastructure, that would be devastating. But there aren't many organizations out there, there aren't many players out there that have that capacity. So you've got to remember that capability is a big piece of what assesses the threat overall.
And presumably, since the number of players with that ability is sort of limited, you would hope that our intelligence agencies have an awareness of who those players are.
Absolutely. You don't have to hope, my friend. Your intelligence absolutely know who those threats are. And when you talk about prioritizing, right, all government money has to be prioritized. The priority goes to those that are the most active, most realistic threat, which is why in many cases, when you read headlines about attacks that have happened successfully, it's been those low priority, those unexpected attacks. And going back to my point about situational awareness, if each individual had a higher level of situational awareness, when those unexpected one-off attackers attack, the actual audience that was there present would have likely had a role in preventing the attack from happening at all.
We've been speaking with Andrew Bustamante, former covert CIA officer and founder of the Everyday Espionage training platform. Andrew, really great having you on. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, David. Thank you very much for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We may be on the brink of getting ourselves an active investigation into a sitting Supreme Court justice. Let's think back to Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings for a moment. Anyone with even the most basic critical thinking and English language skills should have come away from Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings thinking that he wasn't being completely truthful about some of the things that he said. And of course, he ultimately did become Supreme Court Justice for life. That isn't ultimately going to stop an investigation into possible perjury by Kavanaugh, though, because we have video of Democratic Congressman Joe Neguse from Colorado, who's on the House Judiciary Committee. He told constituents on Friday that they are likely going to open an investigation into Brett Kavanaugh for perjury. Take a look at the video from the event.
Looking ahead at the whole impeachment thing, like, do you see Kavanaugh as like a key part of that? And are you gonna try to use his perjury against him in terms of impeaching him?
So I think that's another thing that will come up before the Judiciary Committee. There's no question that perjury, right, during the confirmation hearings and so forth. And so I think the Judiciary Committee is likely to take that up. And some action.
Likely to take that up. Now, immediately, some other Democrats were saying, Joe Neguse is a freshman. He has no idea what's going on. And it's going to be very, very difficult to actually run an investigation, an active investigation into a sitting Supreme Court justice. But we will see. A relevant question would be, which of Brett Kavanaugh's statements does he believe are perjury? Was it about his statements to investigators who were looking into sexual assault claims against him? Was it statements he made to senators? Was it his claims about when he learned certain facts related to the accusations against him? And if you're hearing me list that, you're probably thinking the same thing as me, which is that perjury is very difficult to prove under any circumstances, and particularly when it's perjury related to when someone learns something. These are very, very difficult things to prove perjury on, and that's why perjury convictions are relatively rare. But the one sort of supporting element to this is that Congressman Jerry Nadler was overheard a couple of months ago, or last month, I guess, maybe 2 months ago, on an Amtrak train, saying that it would be possible to impeach Brett Kavanaugh as a judge. I don't know that I see this as particularly likely, Pat, but if there's reason to think he perjured himself, I support an investigation and let the findings fall where they may.
It's going to be so tough to prove, I think, because when he said that he never blacked out from drinking, only he himself is the person who knows for sure that he did or didn't ever black out. when he talks about boofing, like only him and his small circle of friends can like know if that meant anal sex or if it meant farting or whatever the hell that thing meant. It's going to be very hard to pinpoint down some of this stuff because you're dealing with slang and colloquialisms, and I don't think you're going to be able to prove it.
I don't disagree with you, but let's investigate. Let's subpoena, Boofer McGee and Joe Devil's Triangle Smith and whoever else might have something to say about all this stuff. And in particular, let's get that guy, Mark Judge, who evaded having to actually speak publicly during the confirmation hearings. Let's see what they all have to say under oath. And in the end, I think that you are right, that perjury is always hard to prove beyond a doubt. It will be particularly difficult here. But I look forward to seeing Kavanaugh's reaction to the investigation if one ultimately does get going. We have a child in the Oval Office, not a president. And we have actually a child with a particularly poor attention span. We've already learned many times that Donald Trump is watching TV all the time, but there's now a report out that Donald Trump once just walked out of a meeting with Paul Ryan to go watch television in his private dining room. This is back when Republican Congressman Paul Ryan was Speaker of the House, and he went to the Oval Office and he was explaining to Donald Trump what the Republican health care bill proposal had in it. And Trump, according to a former White House deputy communications director, Paul Ryan went on for about 15 minutes. And this is according to Cliff Sims. And Trump sat there sipping on his Diet Cokes and sort of looking around. And eventually Donald Trump just got up and walked out of the room and went to his private dining room and turned on the TV and just started watching television. And Mike Pence was also in the meeting. Mike Pence had to go over and grab Trump and convince him to come back to the Oval Office to finish his meeting with Paul Ryan. And this is a sort of interesting and notable anecdote, but it's not surprising. It's not hard to believe. It's exactly what we've been hearing from anybody who knows Trump's routine as we've learned about it. And what I am thinking back to is how Barack Obama had to work so much harder than a normal president to overcome all of these hypocritical attacks from Republicans, the smears about Obama being a foreign communist, socialist, Muslim, Indonesian, and all that stuff. Obama was staying up late, reading reports, getting up early, reading books day, night, all the time. Trump arguably hasn't read anything his entire presidency. We've learned that he gets this bogus presidential daily briefing with a couple bullet points and a picture or two on it. He doesn't read books. He doesn't listen to staffers. He doesn't often even listen to other elected officials, as we're learning. Barack Obama was slammed for his relatively modest vacation days, and then Trump setting records in terms of the number of days he's taking off and the cost of those golf trips. It contradicts what Trump said he would do during the campaign. He said he'd be at the White House all the time. He'd be working with no breaks. And Republicans don't even care that he's doing the exact opposite. And I was thinking about this and, the obvious double standard, and there is a really big one. But you can't even talk to Republicans about double standards anymore. If you bring up the double standard of Trump's vacation time, if you bring up the double standard of Trump exploding the deficit while claiming he would fix it and criticizing others for the debt and deficit or whatever else, there's a deeper problem here, which is that even if you can point out a double standard on a particular issue, much of the American right has bought into the idea that problems aren't complex, that problems are simple, and that the solutions are simple, and that you don't really need a president who studies and reads and consults and learns. They have bought in hook, line, and sinker to the idea that you just need someone with the right 7-word talking point. Build a wall, ban trans people from the military, bail on Syria, cut taxes, end Obamacare, whatever it is. And when you believe that solutions are as simple as the American right believes that they are, you no longer care about double standards by the president. You no longer care about a president who doesn't read or spend time learning about any of these issues. And that's it, okay? It's a worldview that's not based in reality, and it underlies this entire sort of small government, moron presidents are okay industrial complex, which we saw first with George W. Bush, that was nothing compared to what we're seeing under Donald Trump. Bush at least read the wrong stuff. I'm not romanticizing George W. Bush, but at least he read and listened to advisors. They were horrible right-wing neocon warhawk advisors, but he at least handled this in a more reasonable way. In the back of this, there is this underlying issue of Republicans buying this ruse that the solutions are always really simple. And also when you hear that Donald Trump is just wandering out to go watch TV, I mean, that's the type of thing you think about when you are aware of someone's cognitive decline. So this, of course, continuing to raise more questions and concerns for people on the left, people in the middle and on the right who are sort of connected to the realities of what we should expect from a president. But if you believe that all the answers are simple and you think that as long as you've got the right single talking point, nothing else matters, you're probably not going to be hugely concerned by this revelation. We have a voicemail number. That number is 2192-DAVID-P. Here's a voicemail I received last night about DACA and the government shutdown and negotiations.
Hey, David. My name is Scott. I have a question for you about the, I was just wondering if you considered that this whole shutdown was leading on to something bigger, like a bigger deal that Trump tweeted once that in exchange for full amnesty and might get full funding for border security. Like, I know they were talking about getting $5.7 billion for different parts of the wall, but wondering if this is maybe leading to something bigger, like not 40 or maybe 20 or 30 billion for full border security and full amnesty for the Dreamers and easier immigration policies and such. Yeah, that'd be pretty sweet. A great compromise for both, I think.
Yeah, so I've talked about this a little bit. I would be open. I've said before, I'm against the wall, but I'd be open to allocating some amount of money for the border wall if it did include an actual path to citizenship, a permanent status for DACA recipients. The thing is, I wasn't thinking of upping the money for the wall in exchange for that. I was thinking of lowering it. Like Trump wants $5.7 billion as part of a deal in exchange for 3 years of an extension for DACA recipients. I was thinking of only half of that, like $3 billion, in exchange for permanent status for DACA recipients in the United States. And maybe that's the problem with that idea that you and I talked about yesterday, Pat, which is that if it's going to happen, it's going to have to be for more money, not for less. And then I bail immediately if the idea is $30 billion in exchange for that permanent status.
Oh, yeah, that's way too much. I'm thinking maybe $2 or $3 billion. But it sounds like the idea of declaring a government crisis, an emergency, that seems to be off the table now because it's so overwhelmingly unpopular. So that's a bit of good news out of all of this.
Yeah, if you believe that Trump would be influenced by public opinion, which maybe he is, maybe he isn't, only 7% of Americans in a new poll that we'll cover tomorrow support holding government closed over border wall funding, only 7%. And that does indicate that it would be politically disastrous to declare a national emergency over this if only 7% even think that a shutdown is warranted by it. But that doesn't mean Donald Trump won't at some point panic and declare a national emergency anyway. But good idea. I do have a hope that if anything good comes of this, it would be permanent status for DACA recipients. I just think that the president and Democrats are going to be so far apart as to what it would take that it's not a very likely scenario. We have a great bonus show for you today. Great stories. We'll talk about gun laws. We'll talk about the Tokyo subway and much, much more. Hope to see you there.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.